On 20th January 1931, a telephone call reached the City Cafe on North John Street in Liverpool. A man asked for Mr. Wallace. Wallace was not there yet. The caller left a message with the chess club captain, Samuel Beattie. He gave his name as R.M. Qualtrough. He asked Wallace to call the following evening at 25 Menlove Gardens East on a matter of insurance business. No such address existed. William Herbert Wallace, a 52-year-old insurance collector, would spend the next evening searching for a street that was not there, while his wife Julia lay dying in the front parlor of their home on Wolverton Street. Whether Wallace himself made that call would become one of the most argued questions in English criminal history. Before going further, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so a case like this one is never missed. Now, back to Liverpool. The city in January 1931 was an industrial port on the River Mersey, thick with shipping trade and row upon row of narrow terraced housing. Anfield sat close to the football ground of the same name, a district of small brick houses built for clerks, tradesmen, and collection agents. Wolverton Street ran through the middle of it, a modest two-up, two-down terrace at number 29 among dozens just like it. William Wallace worked as an agent for the Prudential Assurance Company. His job was to walk a fixed weekly round through the Clubmoor area of the city, collecting small premium payments from working households, a shilling or two at a time. Agents like Wallace carried modest sums of cash on their rounds, and their routines were well known to colleagues and to the households they visited week after week. It was steady, unglamorous work, and it required trust. Liverpool had its own city police force and its own assizes, held at St. George's Hall in the heart of the city. Criminal appeals in England ran through the Court of Criminal Appeal, a body created in 1907 under the Criminal Appeal Act. By 1931, it was 24 years old, and it had never once overturned a jury's guilty verdict on the weight of the evidence alone, without new evidence being placed before it. Forensic science in 1931 leaned on tools that were still crude by later standards. Pathologists estimated time of death from the stiffening of a body and from how far digestion had progressed in the stomach. Both methods carried wide margins of error. Blood could be grouped into broad types, but no method existed to match a stain to one specific person. No fingerprint or blood test could place a particular weapon in a particular hand. In a case that would turn on minutes rather than hours, this imprecision mattered enormously. William Wallace had lived in Liverpool for years by 1931, married to Julia with no children between them. He had wider interests than his collection round suggested. He read chemistry books and dabbled in amateur science. His real passion was chess. He belonged to the Liverpool Central Chess Club, which met at the City Cafe on North John Street, and he held some standing there, acting at times in a captain-like or treasurer-like role among the members. He also suffered from a chronic kidney illness, a condition then called Bright's disease, which had troubled him for years before the murder and left him visibly unwell. Julia Wallace was his wife. Her precise age at death was never settled with confidence. She was commonly said to be around 69, though other estimates place her closer to her late 50s or early 60s. Some evidence suggested she had misrepresented her true age to William across their marriage, and that she was born under the name Julia Dennis rather than the name she used. She had no occupation outside the home. She played piano, and the couple were known to neighbors as quiet and somewhat withdrawn, a pair who kept mostly to themselves on Wolverton Street. On the evening of Monday, 19th of January 1931, Wallace arrived late for a scheduled match at the chess club, reportedly around 7:45. Samuel Beattie, the club captain, told him a telephone call had come in 20 or 30 minutes earlier. Beattie had taken it himself, since Wallace had not yet arrived. The caller identified himself as R.M. Qualtrough. He asked that Wallace call at 25 Menlove Gardens East the following evening, Tuesday at 7:30, to discuss a matter of insurance concerning his daughter, who the caller said was about to turn 21. Wallace told Beattie he knew no one named Qualtrough and did not recognize the address. Police later traced the call to a public telephone box a short walk from the Wallace home on Wolverton Street. Whether the man on the line disguised his voice, and whether that man was Wallace himself calling from near his own house, became a question investigators pursued for weeks and never resolved. The timing of the call against the club's own records and Beatty's memory of the exchange would be picked over in exhaustive detail at trial. The Menlove Gardens district was real. It lay in the Mossley Hill area of the city, and it contained genuine streets called Menlove Gardens North, Menlove Gardens South, and Menlove Gardens West. No street called Menlove Gardens East existed there or anywhere in Liverpool. On Tuesday, 20th January, Wallace left Wolverton Street at around 6:45 in the evening. He told Julia he intended to try to find the Qualtrough address. He boarded a tram, then changed to another, working his way toward Mossley Hill. Over the next hour or so, he stopped repeatedly to ask directions. He asked at least 2 tram conductors. He asked a police constable on patrol. He asked a tobacconist. He asked a young woman out delivering milk. Each of them would later be found and questioned by police, and each gave an account of a man who appeared genuinely confused, walking street to street in search of an address that could not be located. By the time Wallace gave up the search, it was close to 8:30. He caught a tram back toward Anfield. He arrived home at Wolverton Street at approximately 20 to 9, or shortly after. Now, back to the record. Inside the small front parlor of number 29, Julia Wallace had been killed by repeated blows to the head with a heavy object. No weapon was ever found. Investigators theorized an iron bar based on the pattern of the injuries, but nothing definite was recovered from the house or the surrounding area. A man's Macintosh raincoat belonging to the household was found beneath or near her body. Its position suggested it had been used to shield the killer's own clothing from blood, a detail that pointed toward a measure of forethought rather than a chaotic, spontaneous attack. A small amount of cash was reported missing, money connected to Wallace's insurance collection round. Other items of value in the house were left untouched. Investigators and later writers on the case questioned whether the theft was genuine or staged to resemble a robbery, since the sum involved was modest against what a determined thief might have taken elsewhere in the house. The scene showed little evidence of a prolonged struggle, which suggested to some investigators that Julia had known or willingly admitted whoever came to the door that evening. When Wallace reached home, he found the front door locked, as it normally was. He tried the back door and found it also apparently secured. Next door lived John and Florence Johnston, who heard him struggling to get inside. The 3 of them worked to gain entry, and Wallace eventually made his way into the house. Inside the front parlor, they found Julia dead. The Johnstons became the first outside witnesses both to the scene and to Wallace's manner in its immediate aftermath. Their later testimony about his composure, whether it read as shock or as something more troubling, became one of the threads the prosecution and defense pulled in opposite directions at trial. Police arrived and called in Professor John Edward McFall, the city police pathologist and a professor of forensic medicine, to examine the body at the scene. McFall based his estimate of the time of death on the degree of rigor mortis in the body and on how far digestion had progressed in Julia's stomach. His conclusion placed her death earlier in the evening than the documented timeline of Wallace's tram journeys and eyewitness sightings comfortably allowed. If McFall was right, Wallace would have had almost no window in which to leave the house, and Julia would already have been dead, or close to it, before he set out to search for Qualtrough's non-existent address. Detectives worked to verify every element of Wallace's account. They confirmed the timing of the telephone call against the chess club's own schedule and Beatty's recollection. They located and interviewed the conductors, the constable, the tobacconist, and the milk delivery girl who had each spoken with Wallace during his search that evening, building out a documented trail of his movements hour by hour. They examined the doors of the house for evidence of forced entry and found none, which suggested Julia had let her killer in herself or that the killer had a key. Investigators also turned their attention to Richard Gordon Parry, a young man who had previously worked for the Prudential on the same collection district as Wallace. Parry knew the Wallace household. He knew its routines, and he would have known when Wallace was likely to be out on Monday evenings at the chess club. Police interviewed him during the initial investigation. He was questioned and cleared at the time, and no charge followed. The central dispute inside the investigation was never who had a motive, since none was ever firmly established, but whether the mathematics of the evening could work at all. Could Wallace have killed his wife, hidden or destroyed the weapon, changed out of any bloodied clothing, and still made his tram on schedule to search for an address across the city, all inside a window of perhaps 15 minutes? Detectives measured distances. They timed tram routes. They tested how long the walk from Wolverton Street to the nearest telephone box would take. Every measurement fed into the case that would eventually go to trial. A coroner's inquest opened into Julia's death in the days following the murder, as was standard practice in England when a suspect might later face criminal charges. The inquest was adjourned to allow the police investigation to continue. On 2nd of February 1931, William Wallace was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. He appeared before magistrates in a preliminary hearing and was committed for trial at the Liverpool Assizes. Wallace's trial opened on 22nd of April 1931 at St. George's Hall and ran 4 days, concluding on 25th April. Mr. Justice Robert Wright presided. Edward Hemerde, King's Counsel and Recorder of Liverpool, led the prosecution. Roland Oliver, King's Counsel, led the defense. Hemerde built the Crown's case around the theory that Wallace had engineered the entire Qualtrough episode himself. He argued Wallace could have placed the call from the telephone box near his home the night before, disguising his voice in order to manufacture a reason to be away from the house at a fixed, verifiable time the next evening. Samuel Beattie was called to describe the call he had taken, but he could not say with confidence whether the voice belonged to Wallace or to a stranger. No witness at trial was able to identify the caller's voice conclusively. Professor McFall took the stand for the prosecution and restated his estimate that Julia had died earlier in the evening than the defense timeline allowed. Defense medical witnesses challenged his methods directly, arguing that estimating time of death from body cooling and stomach digestion in 1931 could not support the narrow window McFall was proposing. The dispute between the medical witnesses ran for long stretches of the trial and left the jury with 2 respected professional opinions pointing in different directions. The tram conductors, the police constable, the tobacconist, and the milk delivery girl were called in turn to describe their encounters with Wallace on the night of the murder. Their accounts taken together showed a man moving across the city asking directions to an address that did not exist, behavior the defense argued was implausible for someone staging an alibi to be remembered. Hemerde countered that this very thoroughness, so many witnesses, so carefully spaced, was itself suspicious, evidence of a performance rather than genuine confusion. The Johnstons testified about the scene they had helped Wallace enter and about his demeanor once Julia's body was found. The prosecution pointed to his composure as unnatural for a man who had just discovered his wife murdered. The defense answered that Wallace was a reserved man by nature and that shock could present as stillness rather than visible distress. Hemerde could not offer the jury a clear motive. No affair was uncovered. No substantial insurance benefit stood to reach Wallace through Julia's death. No history of documented violence or discord between the couple was placed before the court. Oliver, for the defense, returned to this gap repeatedly, arguing that a circumstantial case built on disputed timing and no motive at all could not meet the standard the law required. The jury retired to consider its verdict. It returned in roughly an hour, a strikingly short deliberation for a capital case built on such contested evidence. The verdict was guilty, with no recommendation of mercy. Mr. Justice Wright sentenced William Wallace to death. Wallace's counsel appealed to the Court of Criminal Appeal. The appeal was heard on 18 and 19th of May 1931, with Lord Chief Justice Gordon Hewart presiding over the panel. On 19th of May, the court delivered its judgment. It quashed the conviction. The court held that the verdict could not be supported, having regard to the evidence presented at trial. No new evidence had been introduced on appeal. The ruling rested entirely on the weight of what the jury had already heard. It was the first time an English court had overturned a murder conviction on that ground alone since the Court of Criminal Appeal's creation in 1907. William Wallace was released. He returned to work for the Prudential in a reduced capacity, but the acquittal did little to restore his standing among neighbors and colleagues. He received hostile letters, unsigned and accusatory, sent to his home. Public suspicion followed him regardless of the court's ruling. He eventually left Wolverton Street and moved to a house named Somerville in Bromborough on the Wirral side of the Mersey. His kidney illness, which had troubled him for years, continued to worsen. He died on 26 February 1933, not quite 2 years after his wife's murder, with the case still formally unsolved. Richard Gordon Parry, questioned and cleared by police during the original investigation, was not heard from again in connection with the case for decades. In the early 1980s, journalist Roger Wilkes revisited the murder for a BBC Radio Merseyside documentary and later a book, Wallace, The Final Verdict, published in 1984. Wilkes's case against Parry rested substantially on an account given by John Parks, a garage mechanic who said that on the night of the murder, Parry had brought a car in to be cleaned that appeared to carry bloodstains, and that Parry made a remark suggesting his own guilt. Parks gave this account roughly 50 years after the events it described, and it was never corroborated by any contemporary record. Parry was never charged. He died in 1980. R.V.D. Wallace remains a landmark in English criminal law, cited wherever the power of an appellate court to set aside a jury's verdict on the evidence alone is discussed. Crime writers, including Raymond Chandler and P.D. James, later described the puzzle at its center, the phantom telephone call and the address that did not exist, as close to a perfect construction for a case that could never be conclusively solved. No one else was ever charged with Julia Wallace's murder. The City Cafe on North John Street was a place of marble-topped tables and gaslighting, a gathering spot for clerks and professional men who came after working hours to play chess in a hush, broken only by the click of pieces and the low murmur of moves called across boards. Wallace had played there for years. He was known among the members as careful, methodical, a man who studied a position for a long time before committing to a move. That same caution, colleagues later said, marked everything he did, from his insurance rounds to his manner at home. The telephone at the City Cafe sat near the entrance, within earshot of several tables. When the call came in on the Monday evening, Batty was close enough to answer it himself. He later described the voice on the line as firm, unremarkable, giving no obvious sign of disguise, though he admitted under questioning that a deliberately altered voice might not have struck him as unusual on a call he had no reason to scrutinize. He wrote the name and the address on a scrap of paper as the caller gave them, then read them back to confirm. 25 Menlove Gardens East, 7:30. A matter of insurance business, it was, on its face, an ordinary message of the kind Wallace received from the Prudential's clients often enough. When Wallace read the note that night, he asked Beatty to repeat the details twice. He said the name meant nothing to him. He said he could not place the address either, though he knew the Mossley Hill district only in general terms. Beatty later testified that Wallace did not appear troubled by the message, only mildly puzzled, the reaction of a man facing a minor inconvenience rather than one already aware of what the following evening would hold. The following night, as Wallace worked his way toward Mossley Hill, the trail he left grew more detailed with each stop. The first tram conductor he questioned recalled a man in a dark overcoat asking, with evident uncertainty, whether the tram went near Menlove Gardens. The conductor pointed him toward a connecting route and thought little of the exchange until police came asking about it weeks later. A second conductor, on the connecting tram, remembered Wallace asking again, this time more specifically, whether Menlove Gardens East existed as a stop along the line. The conductor told him he knew of no such street, only north, south, and west. Wallace stepped off the tram in the Mossley Hill area and began walking. He approached a police constable on foot patrol and asked directly whether the officer could direct him to Menlove Gardens East. The constable, who knew the district well from his own beat, told him plainly that no such street existed there. Wallace thanked him and continued on foot, working through the genuine Menlove Gardens streets in turn, checking house numbers against a location that could not be found no matter how carefully he searched. He stopped at a newsagent and tobacconist's shop to ask again. The shopkeeper recalled a customer coming in looking for an address, checking a local directory kept behind the counter, and leaving without success. Later, walking back toward a tram stop, Wallace stopped a young woman making a milk delivery on her rounds and asked her the same question he had asked 5 or 6 people before her. She, too, had never heard of the street. Each of these witnesses would later be traced by detectives working backward from Wallace's own account of his movements. Each independently placed him in a specific location at a specific approximate time, all consistent with a man searching on foot and by tram for an address that had never existed on any map of Liverpool. Investigators measured the walking and riding time between each of these points and matched it against Wallace's account almost to the minute. At the house on Wolverton Street, the parlor where Julia died was a small room at the front of the terrace, furnished plainly, its window facing directly onto the street. Neighbors passing on the pavement outside would ordinarily have had at least a partial view into the room if the curtains were open, though on the night of the murder, no one reported seeing anything unusual through the glass. The Wallaces kept the house tidy and modest, in keeping with a household run on a prudential agent's income. Julia managed the domestic side of their life together, and William's collection round provided their steady, unspectacular living. When Professor McFall arrived at the house that night, he examined the body where it lay rather than moving it immediately, a standard practice intended to preserve the scene for study. He noted the position of the injuries, the extent of rigor mortis already present in the limbs, and the apparent degree of digestion in the stomach contents, cross-referencing what Julia was known to have eaten and roughly when. From these observations, he built his estimate of the time of death, working backward from the state of the body to a window he placed earlier in the evening than the defense's timeline could accommodate. At trial, the defense brought its own medical witnesses to challenge that estimate point by point. They argued that rigor mortis develops at rates that vary significantly with room temperature, a person's build, and the cause of death itself, and that the small unheated parlor on a January night could easily have slowed or altered the process in ways McFall's estimate did not fully account for. They argued the same about digestion, noting that stress, the timing of a person's last meal, and individual variation could shift the calculation by an hour or more in either direction. Under cross-examination, McFall held to his original estimate, but he conceded that the methods available to him were not exact sciences in the way a jury might assume. Hemmerday, for the prosecution, built much of his closing argument around the mathematics of the evening rather than any direct evidence of Wallace's hand on the weapon. He walked the jury through the distances step by step, from the house to the telephone box, from the telephone box back to the house, from the house to the first tram stop, and onward toward Mossley Hill. He argued that a man capable of Wallace's methodical habits at the chessboard was equally capable of planning a killing with the same care, disguising his voice on a public telephone, then manufacturing an alibi built on the testimony of strangers who would remember him precisely because he had made himself memorable to them. Oliver, in his closing for the defense, turned that same argument back on itself. He asked the jury to consider what kind of man stages an alibi by making himself conspicuous to 6 separate strangers within the space of an hour, each of whom could later place him at a specific point, moving steadily away from his own house rather than toward it. He argued that true premeditation would more likely produce a quieter, less traceable evening, not one scattered with witnesses. He reminded the jury that no weapon had been found, that no blood had been discovered on any clothing belonging to Wallace, and that the prosecution had never offered a single concrete reason why a husband of this description would kill a wife with whom no history of conflict had ever been documented. The jury's deliberation lasted roughly an hour, a span that struck observers at the time as short for a case resting on such technical and contested evidence. When the foreman delivered the verdict guilty with no recommendation of mercy, a sound reportedly went through the courtroom gallery, and Wallace himself was said to have shown little visible reaction, maintaining through the reading of his sentence the same composed manner witnesses had described on the night of the murder itself. The appeal hearing in May took place before a panel led by Lord Chief Justice Hewart, in a courtroom accustomed to reviewing questions of law rather than relitigating questions of fact. Wallace's counsel argued that the conviction rested on an inference stacked upon an inference, disguised voice, staged alibi, disputed time of death, none of it proven to the standard a criminal conviction required. The court's judgment, when it came, did not find fault with how the trial had been conducted procedurally. It found instead that the evidence taken as a whole, even accepted at face value, could not support the conclusion the jury had reached. That distinction, Between a flawed process and simply insufficient proof was what made the ruling unusual for its time. Hewitt read the judgment from the bench in a courtroom packed with reporters and spectators who had followed the case since the trial's opening day at St. George's Hall 2 months earlier. He set out the court's reasoning and measured unhurried sentences, tracing each strand of the prosecution's case, the telephone call, the tram journey, the medical evidence, and weighing what each strand could and could not support on its own. When he reached the court's conclusion that the verdict could not stand having regard to the evidence as a whole, a stir passed through the public gallery before the ushers called for quiet. Wallace sat through the reading with the same stillness that had marked his manner since the night of the murder. Reporters in the gallery described him gripping the rail of the dock but otherwise motionless, his expression giving away little as the words that would free him were read aloud. When Hewitt finished and the order for his release was confirmed, Wallace did not rise quickly. He remained seated for a moment, as though absorbing what had been said, before his solicitor leaned toward him to confirm that the ordeal, in the court's eyes, was over. Outside St. George's Hall, a crowd had gathered on the wide stone steps that faced down toward Lime Street, drawn by newspaper reports that a ruling was expected that day. Photographers with large box cameras waited at the base of the steps, and uniformed police held a narrow path clear through the crowd for Wallace to pass. When he emerged, flanked by his solicitor, the crowd's reaction was reported as mixed, some pressing forward with sympathy, others watching in open silence, unconvinced by a court's ruling that a jury of his peers had already rejected once. Flashbulbs went off in quick succession, and newspapermen called out questions that went unanswered as Wallace was guided toward a waiting car. The Liverpool papers that ran the story the next morning gave the ruling extensive coverage, several devoting their front pages entirely to the court's reasoning and to photographs of Wallace leaving the building. National papers picked up the story within a day, treating it less as a local curiosity than as a genuine turning point in how English courts might review a jury's verdict going forward. Legal correspondents covering the hearing noted in print that they could not recall an instance in which the Court of Criminal Appeal had set aside a conviction on these grounds alone, without any new fact or witness placed before it that the original jury had not already heard. Julia Wallace's death has never carried a name beyond the one uncertainty offered from the start. No court, no later investigation, no deathbed account ever produced a conviction that stood. The telephone call to a chess club on a January evening and the address that led nowhere remain the two facts every retelling of this case returns to, because nothing discovered since has explained them with any certainty. R.V. Wallace is still taught wherever English law considers what a jury's verdict is worth against the evidence actually placed before it. Writers who studied the case for decades afterward called it close to a perfect puzzle, not because a crime without a solution is admirable, but because so much careful documentation produced, in the end, no answer at all. The trail of witnesses who watched a man search for a street that did not exist remains one of the most thoroughly recorded alibis in the history of English murder trials, and it was still not enough to settle who was telling the truth. William Wallace went to his grave still publicly suspected of a crime a court had ruled the evidence could not prove. Julia Wallace went to hers with her killer never identified. Between those two facts sits a case that resisted every tool available to solve it, medical, legal, and investigative alike. If this case has held your attention, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one reaches you, and leave a comment with the case you would like covered next.